Hi, I'm Dylan,
And I'm Ben.
and we are two great apes.
We are good friends. We are naturalists, and we are nature educators. And we just like to ask good questions and try to explore the weird things about the universe. So we figured if you've seen any of our other episodes, we get together once in a while and explore whatever is on our mind and kind of bring our unique perspective to that. So our goal by the end of every session is to have some sort of question that may be testable, like a good hypothesis that maybe someone out there would be interested in exploring. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Dylan to see where we're going to start today.
Cool. Hypotheses, humor, and hubris.
That's right.
Uh, I think that as appropriate for we're in spooky season, Halloween or Samhain season, as I think it's more important to acknowledge where the cultural roots are, and I think it'd be fun to talk about world cultural stories about uh, non-humans or other humans. Every human culture has some story about the people in the forest or the wild men or some kind of monster story, some scary thing in the night that's humanoid but not quite us. And also stories of there's almost it's kind of cool. There seems to be uh, in a lot of them stories they'll be contemporaneous with the monsters, say trolls. There'll be stories of more what sounds like a more modern human, like elves or different spirit people. And I've had this sort of intuition for a long time because I've done a lot of I, I can say a lot of research. I've read a lot of books about world cultural stories, and there seem to be these common elements that I feel are pointing to uh, more modern agricultural or metal using peoples interacting with hunter gatherer folks. So copper, bronze, and Iron Age folks interacting with people who are still Neolithic, and also the more spooky one, people that are interacting with uh, it sounds like hominids, but not modern Homo sapiens. So that's just a thing that'd be fun to tease out, and I'm sure by kicking some stories around, I could probably generate a hey, I wonder, are these like are there common traits here? What and I know we'll find it out. So
Yeah.
uh,
Is there one on your mind, especially right now?
I guess immediately off the this is my favorite one because it feels one of my favorites. It feels so on the nose, and I'll tell you why. That's pun intended. Um, uh, Nordic uh, traditions referring to trolls,
Hmm.
and we think like in Lord of the Rings, they've got a cave troll. It's a very large, big rock like monster, but much of the that's also part of it. But there's a distinction where the more I guess we'll call it the more human side of the story is the basic premise throughout Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc. are there's these other people who um, are so much shorter, stockier than us, much stronger. They live in caves and they have large protruding noses and sort of they look like made of rocks. It's a down to the even like the figurines and old drawings, they sound like Neanderthals. All of these different characteristics of them, uh, they can talk, they can converse, they have uh, um, they can interact with modern humans. And usually the older the stories, like, oh yeah, there's a troll, there's a family of trolls that just lives up in that cave there. So we know that Neanderthals, they did literally live in caves. Caves are nice shelters. It's a continuous temperature, and um, it's just an easy utilitarian spot to find shelter in. The long noses, obviously, that's Neanderthals had very dead longer heads than ours. Like if I look in profile, I have a relatively large head. Their head was like another this much further out.
Oh, wow.
Very very large faces, enormous noses, which would look which would look really odd. Except the whole face is larger. Their mouth, their jaw, the whole thing is larger. They have the heavy brow. Their eye sockets, I guess, were larger. So there's a decent chance that that Neanderthals might have also had larger eyes. Or if you look and say, "Wow, they've got what big eyes you have."
Hmm.
So, and that's what's cool about that is if we figure, let's say we just refer to Neanderthals as they're Pleistocene fauna, Pleistocene megafauna. They're adapted, very well adapted to the ice age, the ice ages. They're the shorter, stockier build. They just had less surface area, so they were able to handle, just would have naturally been able to handle cold better, the same way modern peoples that are adapted to cold climates, so like Inuit say, are just have a stockier build compared to say a Maasai, where that's just a build that's designed to be easier to cool, denser bodies easier to stay warm, and that's I guess that's also another commonality when we look at cultural stories in cold climates of the wild peoples. Is you're more likely to get a story of, oh, the stocky or the dense or the much larger peoples. You get these stories, and it tends to tie into that. I forget what the there's this law in evolution. It's like Bernard's law or something. Some English dude's name, the last name begins with B, I think, or Bertram or something like that, where the further north you get, the colder a climate gets within a genus or a group of animals, family of animals, you'll see the colder it gets, the animal tends to be a bit larger, a bit stockier. So
Yeah.
timber wolves are much bigger animals than wolves that would have been indigenous to India, say. So you're going to see this pattern. The colder it gets, the animal tends to be larger, just because it's easier to keep a larger body warm. And a lot of these stories tend to they read true from a naturalist perspective. And one more quick fun tangent on cultural stories and naturalist studies. In the last few years, last decade, maybe the last few years, more animal behaviorists are studying wild animals, have started actually listening to the traditional cultural stories of the people in the area about what animals do, and particularly amongst the Inuit, because it's such a harsh climate. Like you can't tell a story that isn't true. You can't afford to have any kind of untrue story, because you'll die if you say so. If you can't just make up, say like, hey, if you wear a blue hat, it'll scare polar bears. We're like, no, polar bears don't care. They'll eat you no matter what. But they
You just tell those stories to people you're trying to get rid of, right?
Yeah. It's the people trying to get rid of, exactly. And so I'm trying. I forget. I'll dig up the article. We can put that in the links down below. But there were cultural stories amongst the Inuit about polar bears killing walruses with rocks, with going to the edges of cliffs and pushing rocks off.
Oh, cool.
To hit walruses, and it was actually observed and recorded a few years back. And the researchers, I think even before they saw it, they were saying, "Hey, this is a story that's being told." And they say, "Well, it's probably true," and they actually recorded it. So that means that polar bears have entered the Stone Age. They're officially the only other animal on the planet that uses rock projectiles.
Oh yeah.
So when peoples whose very survival depends on accurate passing on of stories, you tend to take that. You have to. It's important to consider. Hey, what if blank blank, dot dot dot.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that's
Cool.
back to back to trolls. The Another element, what's interesting is that so whether it's all these different, so I'm going to, I guess we'll focus on Western European and Slavic stories that just have more of those memorized. A commonality in all these stories that, oh, these people, the other people, the wild peoples, whether they had described as just having clubs and spears or having bows and arrows, and you see different stories like, oh, these are elves, they have clothing, they have everything, but they don't have metal, or these are trolls, they have very limited technologies. All the stories have but they're fading away, or my great grandfather saw one, but that was the last one. So there's this fading away of the other humans, and that it ties in with hunter gatherers being displaced, and with also with the gradual loss of non-modern humans. So there were, we go back far enough, and there were multiple species or multiple distinct morphs of humans that were around at the same time. There was there was a time when we had modern humans, Homo sapiens. We had Neanderthals, which had been separated from us by a few 100,000 years from the modern humans in Africa, or the pre-modern Homo sapiens in Africa. So, and there were also Homo erectus. They were around, and they would have been a whole other. Their technologies were sort of the next step back from Neanderthals. They had a much simpler toolkit, but they had fire, and they'd been around in the old world, and a lot of the there's a decent amount of evidence. So anytime anyone does any sort of as soon as we find a bone that has some DNA in it, there's like a pinky bone in a cave in Siberia somewhere, they find it, they do a genetic analysis, and they look at the peoples in the area and like, oh, they're related to this ancient person. So wherever people went, they did what humans do, and they intermarried. So that's which is another element in stories of trolls, stories of elves. I'm trying to remember the other. I'm trying to dig up the other cultural names. Yeah, do that later when it comes to mind.
There's like giants.
Yeah,
yeah.
The one of the commonalities amongst all these different peoples is there are so few of them. They have a hard time having children, and they're looking for new partners, new wives. Is a common story about trolls looking for wives, or elves looking for mortal blood, because they're sort of falling apart. So that ties in with that's what happens with an isolated population when your genetic diversity just plummets. And if you're reproductively isolated, you're not generally, you don't marry into the new folks as much. You get a bottleneck, and you do start to see more birth defects, more issues. So that is absolutely a adaptive.
Yeah.
So right. It's cultural stories that tie in with naturalist studies. So they're looking at humans from a naturalist standpoint. Like, yeah, that is exactly what you would do if your population has been taking a huge nosedive. And when especially trying to do research on post-contact hunter-gatherer peoples nowadays, only a few centuries after the big European expansion, we sort of reached out into all the other continents. It's hard to find evidence of what was their culture like, where they live, and it's the data is pretty sparse. But if and that's just a few centuries. If you try and look a few millennia back, like in Western Europe, like, hey, when was the last Neanderthal alive, or the last the last skeleton we found is from tens of thousands of years ago, but that's it's a lot harder to really gauge, like, when was that, like, well, we know it was no more recent than
Yeah.
I think it's like 28,000 years ago, something like that, 30 something. But it's like, okay, so that's when they were so common that we're still finding bones, or so common that a cave they were in wasn't later disturbed by modern humans who moved in and then habitated the caves. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that the Neanderthals in particular were probably around many thousands of years after the last specimen. So you start creeping up on when was the last Neanderthal, like the last one, not the last abundant healthy population, but the last Neanderthal and the first modern humans. So it's I think it's a worth. So there's a first hypothesis or thing to test is uh, maybe like even like a statistical analysis on cultural elements or habitation of caves, like modern human habitation of caves, is when was the last remnant population of just Neanderthals in particular, because we have other Pleistocene megafauna that were around till very recently. So woolly mammoths, and you figure like they it's a bigger skeleton, so you find mammoth bones, they're going to last a lot longer, and they would have always been more abundant. There would always have been more woolly mammoths than there were Neanderthals. They were just Ben, you and I as Europeans, we are Neanderthals. We have Neanderthal ancestry. I think the average European has the same amount of, it's like 2% or so. So that means we have the same. It'll be as if we had a great great grandparent who was Neanderthal. So that's what Europeans have. That's why that's why we've got these brows, and Africans don't. That's why I've got this little protruding thing on the back of my head. That's not an African characteristic. That's a Neanderthal trait. It's smaller. It's watered down, but it's still there. So, woolly mammoths, the last known population, was around till 3,500 years ago. So there were woolly mammoths in Wrangel Island in Siberia.
Really?
They were around on an island after, like, a few thousand years after the first pyramids were built.
Wow.
So that's and of course it's hard to be scientific, but it's a very romantic idea. We want to believe that there were still everyone deep down wants to believe there are trolls out there. There are monsters, there are whatever, and that's a sort of a drive. So science has paleoanthropology has a difficult time with handling the romance, but I think it's worth, and it's hard to get a grant. This is all driven, like, can you get grant money to do this study? And it's difficult when you say, I want to find the last troll. The grant that the funding committee is going to be a little bit more. You don't want to end up being just a monster hunter. But that's funny. I'm trying to think. I guess one of the questions is where we have just the last 10 years, we've seen a lot more affordability of genetic testing, like ancestral testing. I bet a good place to look would be to find a spot where there's is there a village in Norway or Finland or something where there's like, whoa, there's a lot more Neanderthal DNA here than elsewhere. I've from what I've been reading, there are some people have much more, like they have like 4% or 5% Neanderthal DNA, which means like, oh, that's just a great grandparent. They could have met this person. They could have had a more modern one. So I guess that would be one of the questions: where are the hotspots of Neanderthal genetic representation? And could you then, so if that people have been like, hey, if you went to the areas, just did the testing, let's say is a village in Norway got a broad, volunteer program, got a broad spectrum of genetic analysis, and just started asking, genealogical questions of the people there. So, where do you live? Where do your ancestors live? What's your matrilineal line? What's your patrilineal line? And then, could you possibly test back to find, like, oh, we know there's a hotspot around this mountain. Is there a cave there? Maybe we could look. Maybe worthwhile look and see, like, hey, like, that would probably be a good place to start. So there's your thesis for grad students trying to, so like, grad students, here's a hint: don't make it look cool. Write the grant as boring as you possibly can. You're in academia, you know how it is. But that ID, it's funny. I found in research done on animal behavior in particular, it's always the cooler and more complex answer. So anytime, I understand the science wants to start from the least cool answer, because otherwise you get too enthusiastic. So you'll get that problem of, oh, my grandfather was an actual Neanderthal. He lived in the cabin. That's going to be the extreme one. But anything that's studied, every animal that's studied is always 99%. It's more intelligent than was previously thought. It has more complex parental care. It has, if it's thought to be a scavenger, it also hunts, or it is more predominantly a hunter. So that's and with the genetic studies on Neanderthal ancestry, we've seen it seems to even be more and more. So just recently, like, oh, some people have much more Neanderthal ancestry. So following that curve, I wouldn't be too personally surprised if it turned out that, hey, there was it looks like there's genetic evidence for a Neanderthal population. I'm going to throw a number out. I'm going to just say 5,500 years ago. And that's ridiculously close. That's, again, within written history, but that's just the way my intuitive sense is that's somewhere we'd see something like that. So that's Neanderthals. More recently, in mythos of the other peoples, the wild peoples, we see stories of elves, and this is close and dear to my heart as a descendant of the British Isles. There's bits and pieces of elf folklore everywhere. So up to and including Neolithic monoliths, standing stones, and earthen mounds, and they're referred to in a mythical setting, and so that tends to be sort of ignored. Oh, that's just a fairy tale, and that means nothing. But if we're going into the same idea, well, fairy tales, they're fun stories, but they also have to have some utility. Lots and lots of what we hear about the elves ties into them being just Neolithic modern humans. So a cool one is that stone arrow points. We're in North America, so we think of arrowheads, projectile points as it's Native Americans, First Nations peoples, and that's a bit more recent. But if you're in Europe and you find a projectile point, that can be from 100,000 years ago, because humans were there for so much longer. So you have these stories about all these different sites where you see, that was an elf village, and even the arrow points themselves are referred to as elf arrows. And there's this it's sort of funny. I have a suspicion they might have had some kind of poisoning technology for their arrows, because a lot of more modern hunter-gatherer people were still hunting with bows and arrows, like the San in Botswana and South Africa and Namibia. They poison their arrows because why not? It's because it works. and there's these this folklore about being elf struck, like, oh, I was struck by an arrow by these invisible people, and the person just becomes sick or has a an illness that just doesn't go away.
Hmm.
And there's this commonality of mythical beings with arrows, and it's not just that they were hit by an arrow; it's that there's some malady that comes after being struck by an arrow. So it's like, huh? If this story was in South Africa, we'd say, oh, obviously it's San people, and obviously they poisoned an arrow. But the different elements of those stories, like, huh, that sounds like oral tradition of a hunter-gatherer peoples. Um, the other characteristics of they live in the wild places. They are very good at appearing, disappearing. They speak the language of animals. All these, you see these different pieces that tie into them being hunter-gatherer peoples. So that's, I guess, the other, or the
Yeah, it's cool. It seems like some of those, whenever things are not understood well, so speaking to animals, the skills that they would perceive, especially over time through story, could be kind of amplified as being supernatural powers or some sort of,
yeah.
yeah, that's really cool.
If we and it's like, I think if you take the story and just put it in a place where there are still peoples that have these skills, these technologies, would we still say that's just a fairy tale? That's just a tale of elves, as opposed to oral tradition about another peoples.
Yeah, you take any story out of context and it suddenly
Yeah.
looks like a fairy tale. Yeah.
And it's and then there's the whole other another piece that maybe should be considered or added on top of it is, was there a time in written tradition? So let's say I know it's very sparse, but like Roman stories of what's again Britain. They got as far north as Scotland, and they made Hadrian's Wall and said, nope, we don't want to deal with these painted people who live north of the wall. That was just too much of a hassle. And there's only those stories are described as factual, as there's these smaller people whose skin is darker, who use who use smaller bows, who raid at night, who do all these other things. And when did the stories of peoples become just fairy tales or were just dismissed? And why we take for granted, oh, fairy tales, we don't take them seriously at all. If you believe in them, we make fun of you because it's childlike. When did that start? Because that's not an, like, what are the cultural underpinnings of dismissing the stories come from? And I'm not saying that we should take every element as being literal fact and not just so say, like, you include metaphors in stories, so probably probably whatever source for the idea of Asgard in northern mythology, they probably weren't actually walking on a bridge made of a rainbow, although that's really cool. But what are the elements there? What are the
Perennial
what
truths and
yeah
principles.
yeah
Yeah.
what do they sync up with?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how, I mean, if you account for how we use stories to basically symbolically encode information that's valuable, but we do it in a way that's um, heuristic, like it's not a factual, it's not necessarily factual, but it's a rule of thumb. It's a guideline. It's something that will be universally true for many generations in many contexts,
Yeah.
right? So those are the things worth preserving. I think that's part of, like, what do you call it? Jordan Peterson's argument around, like, how stories are more than true, because they
Yeah.
have like they don't have all the boring stuff. They have just the condensed, they're nutrient dense, you know?
Yeah, it's the
Uh,
it's the hyper reality, the
yeah,
universality of if you do this, then something good may happen. If you do this, something bad will definitely happen.
yeah. So
Um,
yeah, the idea that people understood the value of that for a long time and were able to use myth not as a see that's where we mistake nowadays.
yeah,
Myths are thrown out as basically just false falsity,
yeah,
lies, right? Instead of symbolic representations of universal truths.
yeah. They reached a point. And maybe a big part is that maybe this is just with westward expansion. We started picking up stories from everywhere, and so hey, here's a collection of Irish fairy tales. Here's a collection of Japanese folklore, and you read it to your kids, and there's no context. So, um, cultural contexts from one place. So if you're reading, to your kid stories about the Inuit about bears that throw rocks, you'd say, "Isn't that silly? Bears don't throw rocks." Like,
Yeah,
yeah, but this isn't the Arctic Circle, so maybe it's just
yeah,
the loss of context
yeah. I
for
think
the stories.
yeah, and then when they're in the proper context, it activates kind of latent instincts and wisdom and knowledge for people that they could use that's been passed on, from their ancestors. I think
Yeah.
it's pretty cool.
And it's also if we let go of the whatever the assumption of otherness, like, oh, it's only in the last century and a half or 3 centuries or whatever that we actually were intelligent, rational human beings that had a capability to figure the world out and make sense of it in our own way. If you let go of that and say, hey, people have always been smart. There, if if you went back 25,000 years ago, there was someone who was a blazingly intelligent genius and didn't have a written word, but I think I'm trying to remember the numbers. As far as modern humans, like anatomically modern humans, since our first appearance, there have been 100 billion of us born and died. The vast majority of us, of course, are before written language. So it seems ridiculous to assume that, hey, there was a Leonardo da Vinci and she was female and she lived in Australia 60,000 years ago. So it's the assumption, and also whenever we look at these stories, they're not recorded when we first meet the people, and they haven't been utterly decimated by disease. I shouldn't say decimated. That means losing 1/10. So they were
Yeah,
just annihilated, and you see
destroyed.
a few people left from whatever the culture, and then after their stories are banned and they're not allowed to speak their language and they can't teach their children, like that's the little bit we have left is usually not as strong. It's like sifting
And
through the
they're taken from their land to their place
yeah,
where thing
and
is. Yeah,
their cultural context. I've lived on the same piece of land for the majority of my life, and I know bird songs from the little hilltop I live on. If I was trying to tell my if I move, so I know how to tell whether crows are and blue jays are actually scolding an owl or whether they're lying. Um, if they if they're interrupting each other, they're telling the truth. If they're just saying, eh,
yeah,
then they want to make sure that they're heard, and my personally is they're listening for other birds reacting.
yeah,
So instead of shouting, stop thief, they're saying stop thief, and then
yeah,
a smaller bird says stop thief, like that's where we can find eggs. But if they're interrupting each other, they don't care about whether they can hear the other birds. It seems that they're actually scolding. I've never seen an exception to this. and that's a cool thing. Just for me walking in the woods, I figured that out. If my son and I moved to Hawaii, where there are no crows or blue jays, that would sound like a fairy tale. If I'm just describing, and I can use naturalist terms. I'm describing how to tell if the crows are lying. That will be, if an anthropologist heard that story, it'll be utterly dismissed, like crows, but crows don't lie. Like, well, but that's so if you take stories out of their context, and you're trying to understand Apache oral tradition in Oklahoma, you're not gonna and stories about roadrunners aren't gonna make sense there. So it's
that reminds me, I actually have one from here, similar, different than your blue jay one, but I remember telling people, if you walk barefoot, if you do the fox walk, you won't squish slugs. You can step on them, but you won't squish them. And my students were like, whatever. He's just, sounds like magic. Well, first of all, if you don't understand sluggy environments, if you're in the desert or something, it'd be a fairy tale. Wow, you can actually step on slugs and not squish them. You can walk on slugs, but it's because of the shape of your foot when it comes down. It squishes. If you step on it, they squirt out.
It pumps.
I had a student actually, after practicing fox walk, do it and experience it. And she was like, oh, I thought you just made that up. That's really cool.
No.
So it was a myth until it happened. Yeah.
It's it's like the different stages of pawing through the stories and the traditions. First we were just completely dismissive of whichever given story. Then we started to accept really over romanticize. And then finally, this is the actual truth. This is like an observation I've had in naturalist studies. I think of it as like it's the 3 stages of animal studies. It's so the chimpanzees. The first story we hear is the dismissive, ugly myth. They're monsters that eat children and rape women and so on. Then the second story, the kind of let's actually take it seriously. The first verse, what Jane Goodall first observes, they're more gentle to each other. They're they help look after the injured. And then finally, and then finally we learn that actually they also wage war on each other. Or wolves, big bad wolves, scary wolf stories. Then wolves hardly ever attack humans. This isn't a problem. And then now in Siberia, in the really, really bad winters, they form super packs of over 100 individuals, and they hunt horses. They'll just raid villages and just take horses, and children have to. There are armed guards that watch the streets, so in case a really hungry wolf tries it on for size on a human child. So that's just you get these different layers. I'm wondering if we might be approaching a point where, with folklore of other peoples, other humans, if we might start seeing, hey, was this who was here, or this island has this story about tiny people. Is that oral tradition about dwarfed human populations,
right?
And so it's also the other question is what's the half-life of a story? How long does a story last before it loses an element, and does it eventually die away? If there's no context,
Go ahead, say more.
If there's no context for a story, if you no longer encounter bears, your bear story is going to fade away and lose their accuracy and shift the tone. If you still have bears, the stories will stay the same. So it's like, well, how long can an oral tradition really last? And it's hard to say, because there's no definitive proof that in Australia, the story of the rainbow serpent is a creation being sort of akin to, like, it's almost like Quetzalcoatl in Central American myths, or the Thunderbird, or other beings like that, creation beings. And there's a story of this giant serpentine creature, and like, hey, there was a giant monitor lizard that weighed like 2 tons that was running around Australia within the time frame that modern humans were present. So it's like, well, how are these stories the same? I think it's stories of, it'd be worthwhile taking a look at, well, what's the distribution of these stories? Is there a I'd be willing to bet, if so, assuming there is a half-life, you would imagine that the most detailed, you find the most overlapping specific details about features of whatever the mythic beast is. They be the most consistent in the last spot that saw them. So I guess tying back to trolls, if you find a spot, story about trolls that sounds, if you find troll stories that sound the most like a living breathing being, as opposed to, oh, they're magic, they can take their heads off and stash them in a cave or something. You probably, that'd be a good place to start looking for genetic tests, or looking for archaeological sites, just digging in caves. Is there a and there's probably spots that we haven't considered looking for a while.
I wonder, in terms of half-life too, like we could look at what are the most recent stories. Sense, right? Because those would be one way. It seems like we could assume the oldest stories would have the most be the most corrupted or distorted, like creation stories. I wonder if those are like the oldest stories. I mean,
yeah, well, if we look at so let's stick with the cultural myths that are the most widely studied, or have the most archaeological evidence of the stories being written down. Western the Western world, so the Indo-European, the larger Indo-European culture civilization, which we're a part of, and it seems that to have originated probably in Western Asia, in the steppes, around 8 or 10,000 years ago, something like that. It seems to coincide with horses. So the this is funny and cool. The Kurgan culture, it's the guy from Highlander. That's the culture that seems to be like, yeah, it looks like those were actually, that's where this language first came from, this culture, and then it spread outwards everywhere, seemingly following horses. And we have so the words that we're speaking English. It's a modern language. It's highly modified, the combination of a bunch of other languages. It's recent. But even in English, there are words, like really basic words, that tie back to a language spoken 8,000 years ago. It's shifted and modified. So the word father, we added an F like 1,000 years ago because the shape of our face actually changed. It used to be a P, so like in Latin, it's pater.
Mm-hmm. Paternal.
Yeah. Apparently, so here's cultural evidence of becoming an agricultural people. When you start eating bread, you have to chew less because it's softer food, and literally your jaw develops a little bit less, and so your incisors, instead of meeting top bottom, instead of meeting right on, your jaw pulls back. You get an overbite. It cocks your incisor a bit forward, and then the fa, which you let that consonant, that phoneme is born. So that's a weird, that phoneme, that word sound didn't exist. It doesn't exist nearly as commonly in hunter-gatherer peoples who don't eat bread. And so we lost, so the pup, so pater became, was father. And the word, there've been some linguistic studies that have tracked back like what are the commonalities of these languages? And they've generated what they call the Proto-Indo-European language, and they don't know this what somebody's like, hey, these are the common features. Probably had this. So the word for father was approximately like pater, but I think there was a click in front of it, so I can't. There's like a glottal, like a sound or something before it, but it's connected. It's evolved and changed, but that piece of the story is there, and the myths from the Proto-Indo-European language, Proto-European culture, the myths are kind of all the same. There was there was a great flood that wiped out the world, and bad stuff happened. Storms occurred. There was some kind of cultural hero that had a hammer that fought a great serpent or beast. A hammer or there was a being. There was a paternal figure who had some kind of spear associated with lightning and storms. So you could say, oh, that's obviously Odin, or oh, that's obviously Zeus, or oh, that's obviously Shiva. But it's all the same story. So these stories also include giants. All these stories, at some point, way back in the day, long, long ago, there were giant beings that shook the earth. So whether we're talking elephants or earthquakes that happen after glaciers recede, I'm living in a town where we still have post-glacial earthquakes. It's a spooky feeling. You're just sitting in your house one day, and it feels like there's a rumble that passes underneath you. Which I'm on the East Coast, we don't have earthquakes, but it feels like there was if you were on a bridge, a concrete bridge, and a dump truck, a loaded dump passed by. That's what it feels like. So these stories are referring to actual things. Someone wasn't just sitting in their shelter saying, huh, wouldn't it be cool if the earth shook? No, this is actual stories. So included into all of that are the other peoples. In Norse mythos, they have there are these beings, dwarves, the Nibelung, who are small, stocky, disproportionately strong, live in caves. These are there's these elements that you find of. It's, if we look at it from a naturalist standpoint, it sounds like pre-agricultural, metal using humans, and it's that's funny. Even if you, here's the thing I hadn't considered. I know I've been speed talking for the last how long have you been recording? What do we have? What's our time? So
a little about 50 minutes, maybe 45 minutes.
Oh, cool. It hasn't been. I was like, is it an hour and a half?
I think it's been close. We're approaching an hour.
Approaching an hour. It will be reasonable to assume that if you had when two cultures meet and you have intermarriage, hybridization, you'd for the amount of genetic for the amount of Neanderthal genes that Europeans have, it wouldn't have just been, oh, one in every 100, one in every 1,000, marriages or partnerships, result from Neanderthals, modern humans. So you'd have more. You'd have villages like, hey, everyone in this village is, half and half or quarter and quarter. You'd see that. The more we look at Neanderthal sites, there are a lot of cave sites that had there were Neanderthals, and then they said, oh, and then Neanderthals just disappear, and there's modern humans, because the tools changed. Actually, no, Neanderthals started using more out of Africa modern Homo sapien tools. So it would make sense that you probably also see cultural stories about the hybrid peoples. So like, hey, this is a village where they're mostly modern human, Like, they passed the paper bag test, as it were, for modernity. But like, wow, why is everyone in this village has a really thick skull? Like, why everyone here can renovate sheetrock with their forehead? What's going on? Everyone, like, geez, everyone here is ridiculously, like, why are their grip strength so strong? So
Yeah.
you probably that would be another thing. Like, just, hey, look to the folklore. Are there any things that you would expect to see with a hybrid people? So even not like, oh, it's not their trolls. No, they're not trolls. They're no, they're normal. But careful of that village. The woman there will snap your neck. And it's oh
With that
wow, huh?
with that hybridization too, I was thinking of how stories would have to fuse and possibly become more confusing or more complex anyway, like having, if you have
Yeah,
marrying of these two storylines, cultures, and they're trying to weave their stories together for their and preserve the best parts of each. It's like stories are going to change anyway. That's kind of another tangent, but
yeah. Here,
what you got?
here's a burly one. This is kind of rough. Wow, a feat like a place to look for cultural patterns would be in um nowadays, the last 2 centuries, where you have uh two peoples meeting. Let's say Western Europeans and whichever folks were taken over Western Europeans. So Native Americans, Native Australians. There are cultural commonalities for um, children of mixed heritage. How do you hide your ancestry if it's ever a shameful thing or an unhumaning thing? So would you see elements? Like, what are the common adaptations, cultural adaptations? Like, here's how we say, oh, I'm just a little tan, or oh, I just always had a big forehead, or whatever the characteristic is. I'd be willing to bet there are commonalities there in how you interact with the rest of the world. And if there would have ever been a period where, hey, my mother was half Neanderthal and I'm trying to pass as a Nord, but I bet you probably, if I'd be curious if there are commonalities um in hiding techniques, passing
Yeah.
techniques amongst people of mixed ancestry. And would you probably, that'll be another thing to look for. So again, this is, what are the commonalities of this hypothetical Norwegian village that sound, that rhymes, or that smell like there's something, will you uh you might even see like a cultural taboo about talking about ancestry or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
um
Hmm.
it's interesting. Like,
Another category that's kind of showing up as we're talking is fringe archetypes. So I'm thinking of like guardians, um, healers, like the shaman, the wizards, in stories. I'm
yeah,
thinking, these people basically anywhere where there's mystery, there's not a lot of clarity, or
yeah,
the role is maybe not fully understood. It's like they generate these powers or these they kind of turn into other creatures in some way that we
yeah,
stories find ways to find their approximation, right? And to generalize a bit. So that's kind of interesting how it may not, and this would be more current, more modern, I suppose, too. But I'm thinking of like stories of like, say, Sasquatch
yeah,
being actually just in some cases the a phase of training that some of the shaman had to go through to become wild men or wild people,
yeah,
and just had to disappear for like 10 years. And when people, if they ever encountered them or had some interaction, it'd be like, what the heck was that? That wasn't us.
yeah.
Um,
It's from So from personal experience, so you and I have both spent time. We've talked about this with our previous casts about like the plausibility of Tarzan, quadrupedal humans. Um, Not everyone has just a body that can easily move quadrupedally, but some of us do. And when you see a human being that can run on all fours, it's disconcerting. And especially you see it at night, they're covered in mud, whatever the thing. It makes sense how those stories would pop up pretty fast. Of oh my god, what the hell
Yeah.
was that?
Yeah.
And the Sasquatch, the big hairy man, the big hairy
Big hairy
people.
man.
That's another cultural trope you see everywhere. Like
Right.
that's always a thing. And again, I'd sort of be curious if there's a that one is a bit would be a bit harder to study. For one, because there's no way you can do it without tapping into like Sasquatch hunting. So that's gonna be really a really hard sell. But I'd be curious if there has been an in-depth cross-cultural analysis on this, because with the just from like I read a lot of books of folklore, and the commonalities seem to be it's a humanoid, it's bipedal, taller than average. So they're no less than, let's say, no less than 7 feet tall, often a bit bigger. And we can, I think it's reasonable to fudge those factors, because if you see us like being in the presence of a 7 foot tall human being, that's always you're taken aback. And that's when they're not trying to hide, and you're not scared, and they're not wearing a big cloak made of bear fur or something. So it's very easy to say this was 10 feet tall. It's like, how big was the fish? It was this big. It's, when you're scared, things appear larger. But they're at least 7 feet tall. They're usually covered in fur. They have a quite often they're either not wielding any tools, or they're wielding either a spear or a club of some sort, large long-handled bludgeon. They throw rocks. That's a big commonality, is rock throwing large rocks, which is if you have it's sort of funny how proportionality changes. Once a person is above a certain height, just the way they walk looks different, because it's your center of balance is different. Like if you watch a very slender person walk, it's like, whoa, it's like that giraffe slow motion thing, because they're so they have to lean forward a bit more, the wind doesn't flip them over. And they tend to be solitary, live in small groups. They live in isolated areas, predominantly forested areas. They're very protective of their forests. There's territoriality is a universal trait of the hairy men stories. So if it's Sasquatch, if it's Messing, if it's for North America, I'll just
Yeti.
I won't. If it's the Yeti, if you're in Australia and it's the Yowie, if you're in Europe, it's the Green Man or the Woodwoes. If you're in Britain, although those weren't as tall, they were smaller hairy men that had clubs, lived in the woods, etc. Interestingly, they were actually similar to the unicorn myths, like the wild masculinity, along with the idea of they could be tamed by maidens of virtue true, that sort of thing. In Austria, it was the Rubensal. I don't know if it's pronounced properly. Giant shape shifting creature lives in the mountains. They're often associated with changes in weather. So they cause storms, do they cause storms? Let's say it's a person, an animal, whatever, that tends to move when there's more storms or wind. There are predators that preferentially hunt when there's wind, because they can't be heard. And then it's easier to hide if it's easier to hide moving through trees. The trees are also moving. It's just that's a behavior you do when you're trying to stalk, trying to be unseen. In Russia, it's the Leshy, the protector of the birch forests. And the list goes on and on about everywhere there's some story of a tall, furry, possibly shape-shifting human, usually described as male, described as being territorial and throwing rocks. It's a big commonality.
You also mentioned a couple times like guardian or protector.
Yeah.
Is that a common, it's attributed to them as well, or is that just like an interpretation of territoriality? Or
it's universally described as I can't think of a hairy man story where there's not some version of get out of my trees, stay out of my trees.
Yeah.
So like the Russian, the Leshy, that's the whole point. And there's also there's reasons for having cultural stories don't take too much from the forest or the whatever will get you, but it's specifically that's the big point about Leshy is that there's a strong cultural taboo against harming living trees or hunting in an irresponsible manner. And it's funny, it's like I think there's a very arrogant perspective coming from Western anthropology that, oh, sure, they made up these stories to tell their children. Like, so basically saying they lied to their children and their children believe it. If you're actually hunting in the birch forest of Siberia and you're a hunter, you have to deal with wolves and bears and Siberian tigers. There's dangerous stuff out there. Objective, like this will kill you and eat you. You have barren ground polar bears. These are real problems. And it's like, hey, I was treed by a polar bear once, but I've never seen a tall, hairy man. There's so it's the fact that there's the commonalities and they haven't shifted. Why say it's a tall, hairy man? Why not say, if you're gonna make something up, like, hey, there's no tall, hairy man, say it has add something more monstrous onto it. It's a giant spider. I don't know, something that will scare people. Yeah. But if that's my the curiosity Dylan has, the romantic out myself romantic. Is this a remnant population of Homo erectus, of giant Homo erectus? They were the first humans to leave Africa, and they were in the old world for 600,000, a million years, a ridiculously long time. They were present, and they even when they first came out of Africa, they were tall. That was a big thing. There's no reason to assume if you had people who had we have people all over the world who are locally adapted to their conditions. We're Western Europeans. We have pale skin because we're adapted to deal with starvation. This is a starvation adaptation. So we don't die of vitamin D deficiency. So especially when your technology is more limited, you would expect to see more physiological adaptation. If you're not as adept at thinking of a new way to survive, it's going to be the ones who are disproportionately more physically adapted to survive. So if you live in a climate and habit, or if your hunting style gives a disproportionate advantage to being much taller, you could see that. I mean, if you took the tallest people in the world, tallest non-gigantes, and just picked athletes from the NBA and WNBA, and so put them all on a continent with no other people, you'd see taller people there. So it's not too much of a stretch to say, hey, if there were people, let's say they were only 6'8" on average, and then you have Bronze Age Europeans interact with them. Bronze Age, everyone, we all, once agriculture came, we all lost 5 inches on average. We used to be much taller. So if people who are shorter than they are nowadays, the men are 5'5", they're all dwarfed because we're starving all the time, and then we interact with a people who live in smaller populations, maybe they're furrier. Why not? And they were, like 6'8". There are populations of people in the world, in West Africa that are very, very tall. and you interact with that, there's no reason to say, "Hey, I'm this short person." And especially if you're not referring to them in height and actual feet
Mhm.
or meters, you're saying, "How tall are they?" They were 5 head heights taller than me. So what will be the equivalent? So if you hear the story, how tall are they? So if you found features in the stories, they were taller than a grown man can reach. Like, how tall was a grown man at that time?
Right.
I'm 5'9 3/4. I can reach seven. My hand is like 7 feet and 5 inches, something like that. My tiptoes, I can 7'6". So if you if I say, if I was shorter, like, hey, a human being who's just 6'8", perfectly possible, that's living in a small population, is more isolated, and just requires a large amount of territory to survive. Like, hey, we're predominantly eating. We don't cook our food as much. We're predominantly eating, say, sweet chestnuts or whatever game we can find. That would be. I think that to try and find any truth in
Breaking up a little bit.
honest. We don't want a big hairy man if we try to find truth. You get the last thing I said? Oh,
Uh,
you broke up for a sec too.
yeah,
But
yeah.
you're back. You're back. I can see you now.
Say it again.
Yeah. So if someone here's the hypothesis to test. What are the commonalities of the big hairy men stories around across the world? Let's it would be to try and see, is this evidence? Yes, we're looking at like the central thrust here of the talk is, what are the if we were trying to test cultural stories for accuracy, we'd expect to see certain commonalities. So if we're treating stories of polar bears throwing rocks, and if you're treating those kind of stories the same way, if you treat the big hairy men stories, what will be the commonalities of those stories? What would be what are characteristics of stories that are actually warning about living creatures, and what are the common features? So that would probably be the if someone were trying to test that.
Hmm.
And also, it's instead of looking at always if the assumption is given that, hey, this is a wildly different species than ours, like, well, why does it have to be wildly different? What if what if it is just a tribe of modern Homo sapiens that were disproportionately tall, that culturally lived in smaller groups? Maybe they had a neurotype that just didn't work. Maybe they were autistic. Wild, giant, furry autistics. That's
Hmm.
perfectly reasonable. And that's the and I guess that's also maybe a final fun point to tie back to make it more modern. We're seeing more and more study of neurodiversity in people, and a cool thing that's starting to appear. I'm a member of a Facebook group of neurodiverse people, and I just was sort of curious. I popped out questions like, so how many of us have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or some kind of connective thing? And it's like a way like, oh my God, I do. And like everyone asks, because there are certain physiological conditions that have nothing directly to do with your brain. So there's connective tissue atypicalities, abnormalities, call it what you want, that are associated with diverse neurotypes. They're associated with people who think differently or process information differently. Um, I'm very obviously not. I'm very obviously neurodivergent, and my I have the working body as well. My connective tissue is not average. And if we also everyone's you hear people grumpy say, there weren't autistic people back when I was a kid. Like, sure. And your grandfather who ate the same meal every day for his entire life and compulsively counted wasn't Like, no, it just we're treated with these. The human neurodiversity has always been present, and it's kind of cool. I find if you find the I find when I look at modern cultural features in the neurodiverse community, and even this is my favorite, even in the kink community, um, is like, oh, these are cave people. The oldest figurine, the oldest humanoid figurine was, I believe, was third. I want to say 38,000 years ago, might be more recent. It was many tens of thousands of years ago. It was carved out of ivory. It was a humanoid body with a lion head. It was a cat person. It was a freaking thundercat. So people have been mixing up these concepts of, so I mean, furries have been around since the dawn of time. That's all. Put it that way. There's always been some element where the human mind has been. It's all we've always been weird. There's that back in the day, it might even have been more weirdos. So I think that's just another thing to consider about
Yeah.
Cultural stories. When you hear like, hey, what was this? Like, what was this monster? Was that a monster, or was that just your, the weirdest, the weirdest cousin out of the whole crew of grandchildren? Like, hey, actually, they just are really good at running on all fours, and also incidentally, they happen to be really furry. Or maybe it's just the furry ones that survive long enough.
Right.
So
There's on just on that, and probably should wrap up here in a minute, but the kind of stacking on that, the possibility of some cognitive or psychological things that we do, such as confirmation bias,
yeah,
seeing what you want to see, kind of thing. You and I have played enough with human psychology in stressful environments where we know people make things mean things,
boom.
Yeah. So not only could someone hallucinate or see more than reality, and then therefore store that as the story that they carry on, but also what you said earlier about maybe wanting to make the story more, like, embellish the story to make it more impactful. So if it's a teaching story for kids or something that they are really scared, don't go over there, whatever. But those things combine, so we have this like internal quality too of like how stories can get exaggerated um through bias or whatever, through trauma too, by the way, right?
Yeah,
Like
you
traumatic
could.
events, if someone's actually attacked by a bear, like,
Yeah,
what do they actually take away from that and pass on? So all of these things, plus the weirdness that you're mentioning, like the
yeah,
physical, the unique attributes, I'm like, you put all that together, man, you have a landscape of for
yeah.
mythology to really be creative.
You could probably adjust for that. Um, I'd be willing to bet someone's done some research on the ratio of exaggeration. When someone's really scared, is there an average amount of exaggeration? How big was
Yeah,
the shark when you were in the water with it, or how big was that bear? No
right.
one says the bear was 1,000 feet tall. So I mean, you could say, well, no, the data's always like, yeah. No one says the bear was 3 feet tall. No one says the bear was 1,000 feet tall. Somewhere in the middle is going to be an average of how much bigger is the bear, how much bigger is the other person, or how much stronger. Um, it's that's another thing. The When you encounter a person who's disproportionately strong, it's an unusual. It's kind of weird. Like, whoa, what did they like? So if you have a person who's really strong and knows how to lift, they can move a really freaking big rock. Just that thing. So it's like they moved a rock the size of a car. Like, yeah, the rock was kind of balanced, so they only had to push. They only had to push 500 pounds, not the 3 tons that it was. So I'd be willing to bet if you took the stories, averaged them out, found the regions where there was the most commonalities, and then looked at those stories, filtered them through the lens of what's the average rate of exaggeration people are scared, then you could probably, shorten the taller people,
Mhm.
um, and then see, well, what's left? How plausible is this? And if the story were just completely made up, then you wouldn't expect to see as much So he said that's what will be worthwhile, is looking is filtering out the stories, and then maybe with Neanderthals bigger, looking for clusters of archaic DNA.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, because it's Halloween, I know we have to wrap up the final point. Someone's gonna hopefully someone watching will say, but what about werewolves and vampires? It's rabies. It's rabies. It's awful. It's always been rabies. Vampires is very, very specifically that's rabies. It's horrifying. I think it's a big reason why Europeans are so damn crazy, is because 14th century, 15th century, there was a rabies epidemic. This is why you see this is why there's so many vampire stories in Eastern Europe. I don't know, a person who suddenly acts aggressive, is adverse to bright light, is scared of running water. The Greek name for it is hydrophobia. So it's very specifically a rabies. It's a rabies epidemic.
Is there, that's great. Is there a link to bats as well? Bats and rabies, yeah.
There's absolutely a link to bats and rabies. And oh, someone was bitten by a dog or a wolf. There was something wrong with it, and then they became a monster. Like, yeah, it's spread through bites. They're afraid of that. No, there's a transformation from a normal healthy person to a scared or aggressive or irritable person. Like, yeah,
that's great.
It's rabies. No Neanderthals, just rabies.
All right. Well, thanks for demystifying our world there.
Sweet. Well,
awesome.
Until next time.
Until next time. Thank you everyone for watching. And thank you, Dylan.
Thanks, man.
See ya.
Bye.